First, we're going to begin tonight with an even bigger story about one of the world's largest banks and how it may actually be in full crisis mode. While it tries to present its situation as simply a, quote, restructuring. How Deutschebank may be a shell of what it used to be as an investment bank. How terrible financial decisions may be leading to its eventual collapse. How its billions in derivatives exposure might lead to a need for a bailout. Bailout. Remember that word? Sound familiar? Also, we've looked into what it reported as its net income in 2018. And the number should probably have sent alarm bells to any bank auditor who happened to be looking at the time. Were they? What are we not being told about the health or the lack thereof regarding one of the world's largest banking institutions? A bank that is large enough to cascade a global downturn and most definitely, if nothing else, certainly affect the European economy. This is the News with Rick Sanchez, where we believe it is time, with stories like this, to prove that we do news again, real news. So we here on the News with Rick Sanchez, as I think you've come to know when you watch us every night, we try our best to do two things consistently, if nothing else. We try to get out ahead of stories that the general media is ignoring, and we also try to then drill down on that story to try and give you the information that is below the surface, what we like to call the real story, right? So tonight, we ask, what is the real story involving Deutschebank? Is it having serious financial problems that could even lead to some kind of collapse? We have some eye-opening original reporting on this story by my colleague and co-host of Boom Bust, Christy I, who is good enough to join us now here on the set. Let me start with this, the word restructuring. They're using that as their argument for firing 18,000 workers, but do you buy that word?
Well, let me ask you something. Why would you need to restructure something? Do you restructure something when things are going well, when you're making a lot of profits? No, you restructure something, you repackage something, you pivot when the house is actually on fire, when the house is actually burning down. So that's exactly what's happening right now. They're trying to shed some dead weight in the form of human capital. Like, that's why they're firing so many employees. They're cutting the costs, they're shedding dead weight, and they're trying to also spin off a lot of their dead weight assets as well. These toxic assets that they're trying to silo out and carve out into a different branch called a bad bank.
You talk about their investment banking structure and how you see that as a dead giveaway for problems ahead. Explain that to us.
So let's take a look at their balance sheet first, because the numbers actually don't lie at all. DB has a massive derivatives exposure, 43 trillion euros of derivatives. Now, derivatives isn't really a bad word. It is a financial instrument. It's a very valid financial instrument. But the problem is when you abuse it too much, when you make bets on top of bets, which is exactly what happened here. This massive derivative exposure isn't necessarily a couple trillion. It's more likely a couple $1 billion of assets, real assets, that they then made bets on top of, which then kind of spiraled out of control and became this $43 trillion of exposure, both on the long side and on the short side. So that in and of itself is what kind of led to the collapse of 2008. So this is actually very reminiscent and very fresh in our memory.
So it sounds like what you're describing is Bear Stearns. You're describing Lehman Brothers, companies that essentially went out of business.
Exactly.
Right?
But it's fine because banks actually do this all the time when it's in a controlled environment. However, the problem is right now, if you look at Deutsche Bank, you mentioned this earlier, their 2018 earnings report, they revealed a profit of only 267 million. Now, let's think about that figure, because Deutsche Bank is one of the largest investment banks in Europe. They are ranked number 6 globally. They have worked on IPO deals the same as JP Morgan and Goldman Sachs. They did Alibaba, they did Aston Martin, they did Oceans, they ran so many deals. They were lead book runners even. So how would a bank that massive and have that much influence and scale in Europe, so much reach, only report a profit this low when money is basically free in the EU?
So say that again. In 2018, they reported a net income of, what did you say?
267 million euros.
Let me tell you something. I know community banks in South Florida that report more income than that.
Exactly.
So how in the hell can this be categorized as one of the world's biggest banks if it's only reporting a net income of 287 million?
Exactly. So that's why a lot of people are asking, like, where is this going? So that leads us to believe that there is something, and it might be the derivatives exposure that is continuing to add to the losses, that they're actually accumulating a lot lot of losses within Deutsche Bank.
So people are watching this segment from all over the world, and they're thinking, if these guys go under, it's going to cause big problems. They tried to stop this from happening. They just tried to do a merger, I believe, with Commerzbank, with a Z, right?
Yes, Commerzbank.
And that fell apart.
Yeah.
Is that another sign for you?
Well, they fell apart, and this entire merger was actually instigated by German officials. German officials saw that these two banks were in a very vulnerable position, so they were the ones who actually initiated the merger talks. They wanted Deutsche Bank to merge with Commerzbank because they thought that two banks together would make it more stable, more liquid.
Well, anytime a small person needs to be bought by somebody bigger to have them survive, and the bigger party says, you know what, I've looked at your books and I don't like what I see, I'm not going to marry you.
Exactly.
You go see if you can find some other boyfriend or girlfriend.
Merger talks fell apart. Exactly.
That's what this says.
They walked away.
Oh my goodness.
So the entire thing fell apart.
What happens if this falls apart and they collapse? I mean, I know this is a big question but what's the concern?
There will be huge concern about systemic risks. What are the risks to the contagion effects within Europe? Because as we mentioned, these are derivative swaps, which means that there are a lot of interbank connectivity within Europe. Deutsche Bank right now is on the hook for $43 trillion worth of assets. So who is the other counterparty? Who is the counterparty who they would be on the line for? Those would be the guys who are asking Deutsche, hey, where is my money? This is very reminiscent to AIG and Lehman Brothers, because when AIG fell, when they went bankrupt, all the other banks were like, hey, where's my money? Well, we don't have any. Those were not marked to market.
Christy I, with her usual groundbreaking reporting and analysis. You do good work. We're so happy to have you. Thank you.